A centenary is always a good time to revisit our history, and rarely of more significance than that of the 1926 general strike, correctly described in this thoroughly researched book by Peter Taaffe that Mentmore Press have just reissued as the most important event in the history of the British working class. And in 15 minutes or so, I can only give you an overview of three key themes that I think trade unionists should focus on in remembering those 9 days of May 1926. Number one, above all, to highlight the determination and initiative taken by millions of workers, which, in contrast to some other countries where perhaps there's a greater tradition of spontaneity and generalised action, remains for now the only clear example of ongoing generalised industrial action encompassing most of the British working class. Only the 84-85 miners' strike comes anywhere close. Secondly, to recognise, however, that those lions were led by donkeys at the top of the TUC General Council. Right-wing union leaders like Jimmy Thomas of the National Union of Railwomen were from the outset desperate to reach some kind of settlement, even at the price of total capitulation, rather than allow a movement to develop which would take control of events away from their hands and into the hands of the trade union rank and file. But could the best of the shop stewards, especially those gathered around the fledgling Communist Party, have done anything differently to prevent that betrayal? And thirdly, it's important to consider the lessons of that history and how they can be applied today. Because in 2026, British capitalism finds itself again in a parlous state, even before the New World recession, which looms large in the fears of the serious strategists of big business. In the face of further generalised attacks on workers' living standards, when will it be right to again demand a general strike? And if so, of what nature and duration? Now let's start with 1926, or actually shortly before that, with the First World War, because the general strike grew out of the declining state of British capitalism following that war, after which US capitalism had become the new colossus. The 1 million British miners made up 10% of the labour force, and the state of the industry and of miners' working conditions reflected the parlous state of the economy as a whole. The coal bosses demanded that miners accept lower wages and longer hours. Faced with this onslaught in 1924, the most militant fighting elements in the British trade union movement created the National Minority Movement to act as a rallying point for the left in the unions, organising from below to defeat the government and employers' offensive. And the minority movement amongst the Welsh miners was responsible for the election of its new left leader, A.J. Cook. Faced with a powerful working class, but as yet unprepared for a showdown at this stage, the Tory government bought time by proposing a 9-month subsidy to the coal industry to allow the same wages to be paid up until the end of April 1926, and also to set up the Samuel Commission to make a report. Thatcher did something similar in 1981 before taking on the NUM in 1984-85. Now, the ruling class used the time gained to build up, under Churchill, a scab army, the OMS, the Organisation for the Maintenance of Supplies, involving the fascists, to be used in the event of the strike. And while the strategists of capital carefully laid their plans, the working class was lulled to sleep. The TUC Strike Organising Committee first met only 6 days before the actual general strike began. A.J. Cook and the militants of the Young Communist Party sincerely wanted the victory of the general strike. Even the sort of more pragmatic winning of the TUC, around people like Ernest Bevan, believed in the possibility of victory, But more thought that they could bluff the Baldwin government into retreat by threatening a strike. But like Kinnock in 84-85, right-wing leaders like Thomas wanted only a settlement, even a defeat, as a way to discredit calls for strike action in future. So the right wing of the General Council urged the miners to wait for the decisions of the Samuel Commission. But when it reported, it agreed that the mines were inefficient and badly run, but that right now immediate reductions in miners' wages were necessary. The mine owners mapped out a savage policy of wage cuts to be implemented after the 30th of April. South Wales miners, for example, would see their weekly earnings nearly halved, from 78 shillings to less than 46 shillings. Yet Thomas declared that the Samuel Commission report was the basis for an honourable settlement, a phrase repeated in the official TUC strike bulletins throughout the general strike. But a mood of expectation and a certain eagerness for the coming battle developed amongst the miners and the broader working class. The workers on the railways, in engineering and so on, all understand that if the miners were defeated, they'd be dragged down as well. The General Council couldn't oppose the strike, but instead sought to control it, so that they could betray it if the time was right. And the decision was taken to call the strike at midnight between the 3rd and 4th of May. And when the strike began, the response of the working class was immediate and massive. Peter quotes from The Common People by Postgate and Cole, saying there were no trains, no buses, no trams, no papers, no building, no power. In a strike, 100% is an unobtainable figure generally, but even this ideal 100% was frequently achieved. Churchill's army of scabs was largely ineffective in the face of the obvious power of the working class, which rose, as in Shelley's poem, like lions, in a magnificent display of working class power. With no preparation and little organisation, the enormous capacity for improvisation of the workers was shown. With over 400 trades councils in operation and over 100 councils of action, becoming effective organisers of power in their area. In significant parts of the country, these bodies began to assume more and more the role of an alternative workers' government to that of Baldwin. The heart of the strike was in the solidly industrial areas. Each day of the strike reinforced the feeling of the working class being pitted against the power of capitalism as a whole, but also gave growing confidence that the working class could win that struggle. Just to give a few examples, in Scotland, the Great North Road became the working class Strait of Hormuz, if you like. No cars passed without the permission of the local trades council, and to make sure miners had a rope across the road. In London, a plan borrowed from France had been put into action. Women put their babies on the road in front of commercial vehicles, and when the car stopped, a man jumped on the footboards, turned out the drivers, and smashed up the engine. Here in Lancashire, as reported in the Preston Strike News, a team of motorcycle couriers exchanged regular reports between different districts. And unlike the official, rather dull TUC Daily Worker, these kind of local bulletins, like the Preston Strike Bulletin, were full of flair and wit. For example, here, there's a tongue-in-cheek report from Huddersfield. Slight disturbance on Monday, but the OMS scab driver is now out of hospital. And reports that train companies who had been saying that trains were running must be running ghost trains because they were actually nowhere to be seen when you went looking for them. Similarly, the Kensington Strike Bulletin announced on the 7th of May, the strike is over. Only 400,000 NUR men are now on strike, plus 1 million miners and 2 million others. But 3 trains are running in Manchester, and there is a 5-minute service every 2 hours on the tube. A bag of coal has been brought from Newcastle today. Again in Preston, police baton-charged strikers trying to stop buses, and a crowd of thousands sought to storm a police station to rescue an arrested striker. And by the second week of the strike, police brutality became more severe and frequent. However, many local engineering workers were being told by the General Council's instructions to hold back and stay in work as the second wave, which was unnecessarily holding back the potential strength of action. But by the end of the first week of the strike, the TUC General Council were desperately attempting to rein it in and secretly opened negotiations with the government via Herbert Samuel. Sadly, the best militants had in general been naive about their leaders' willingness and not seen the betrayal coming. Even some of the supposed lefts, like Purcell of the Furniture Trades Union, were involved in the talks but put up no resistance to the coming sellout. And the government were looking for complete surrender, not a negotiation. And on the 12th of May, that's what they got, even though that was the day when actually the highest number of strikers yet were out in action. And the first assumption of the rank and file was that if this strengthening strike was now being called off, they must have won. The reality, however, was that they'd been sold a serious defeat. The miners were forced to continue to battle alone until they were forced back too. The ruling class took their revenge. The mine owners inflicted brutal cuts on the miners and sought in the process to crush union organisation. Some strikers were weeded out. My own grandfather was listed up by the Great Western Railway for demotion from his job in Paddington, for example. The government also introduced their anti-union 1927 Trades Disputes Act. If Thomas had wanted a defeat, he'd certainly got one. So what lessons can we learn from 1926? Because certainly this is a history that deserves to be remembered, but in order to learn for the struggles that are yet to come today. Could the treachery of the likes of Thomas have been circumvented? Because really his treachery came as no surprise. As Leon Trotsky had put it in a speech in 1925, we must look facts in the face. The principal efforts of a considerable number of official trade union leaders will be directed not towards paralysing the bourgeois state by means of the strike, but towards paralysing the general strike by means of the bourgeois state. But this book points to the real problem being that too many of the best shop stewards, including in the CP, had expected the lefts, like the undoubtedly sincere but rather confused Cook, to stand firm. They didn't. Purcell, on the other hand, had already shown his true colours, doing nothing to defend the CP when the Labour Party right wing had excluded them from Labour Party membership in 1925. The book argues that as a small yet influential party, the CP may not have been able to have decisively changed the outcome of May 1926. However, with the correct approach, it could have certainly emerged as a significantly stronger force in a prime position to influence the struggles that were yet to come. Instead, it failed to warn in advance of the political weaknesses of lefts such as Purcell and Cook. They shouldn't have done that in a shrill, sectarian way, accusing them of betrayal at every opportunity. No, but definitely a firm line of positive criticism, demanding that the left stand up independently to the right, using the powerful minority movement to apply pressure from below. Because if Cook and others had clearly called during the strike for rank and file resistance, had rejected the proposal for capitulation to the government, for a continuation of the strike, for a widening of the elements of workers' power through the councils of action, this would have met a massive response from the miners and the rest of the working class. Sadly, some in the Communist Party, believing the problems were as much organisational than political, had raised mistakenly as one of their main calls all power to the General Council, which means really all power to their betrayers, rather than concentrating on the call for building councils of action from which to resist the TUC leaders' attempts to capitulate. If councils of action had developed and filled out and become more like British Soviets, if you like, even for a short period, this would have established an enormous historical reference point for the working class in future battles. And as a result, not only was the strike defeated, but that the gains that the CP had built up in the strike were lost, and the potentially powerful minority movement which it had led fell apart. So the final thing to perhaps look at is, well, will we have another general strike? Now, in 2026, capitalist historians are undoubtedly going to be keen to drum home that the strike was a defeat in 1926, to put off trade unionists from ever pursuing the same tactic again. But just as in the 1920s, in 2020s, the state of British capitalism still means that at some point there will inevitably be generalised attacks on workers' pay and conditions, which will require generalised action to defeat them. And there's no reason to draw pessimistic conclusions from 1926. But the lessons must be learned, that the defeat stemmed not from the strength of the employers, but in the weakness of those at the top of the working class movement. So it is absolutely necessary to fight for a strengthening of the leaderships of the trade unions. However, that must also always be counterbalanced by democratic control and the building of structures such as the shop stewards movement, which can more accurately reflect the ordinary members. This can act as a check on the leaders at the top, no matter how radical their credentials may be. Because the employers and their governments have an array of weapons to ensnare and corrupt. To counter this, a militant, accountable and politically aware leadership must be built. This is why the Socialist Party fight today for trade union officials to live on no more than the average wage of the skilled workers that they represent, and to be subject to regular election and recall. An all-out general strike is also inevitably a high-stakes strategy, one that raises the question of who runs society. As the working class moves into action, it starts to see that it has the power to control production and distribution. It starts to glimpse the outline of a different society under the democratic control of the working class, organised to meet need instead of profit. And the establishment politicians recognise that too. Peter's book recounts the tale of when the then Prime Minister Lloyd George met with trade union leaders in 1919 to discuss an earlier threatened strike. He said to them bluntly that if they took action, they could indeed defeat the government. But what then? For, said the wily Lloyd George, if a force arises in the state which is stronger than the state itself, then it must be ready to take on the functions of the state or withdraw and accept the authority of the state. Gentlemen, have you considered? And if you have, are you ready? In 1919, those leaders knew they were not ready, and nor were those of 1926. Rather than an all-out general strike, the movement may first need to build for warning strikes to extract concessions. Perhaps a 24-hour general strike, where the working class as a whole can feel its united strength. But these would still be staging posts along the way towards strikes like 1926. And this is why the events of 100 years ago are so important still today. And I'll make my closing remarks a speech from a young miners' delegate at the TUC conference in Bournemouth in September 1926. When the delegate Peter Chambers said to all the collected delegates, "We will have another general strike, but without you, and we will win next time." As Peter says in his book, the next time has not come now for 100 years, but history has a way of confirming prophecies much later than when they were originally formulated.